Imagine waking up before dawn, the air still damp with the night's chill. You're not a knight in shining armor, nor a noble with servants. You're an archer, a peasant, trained not in lavish halls, but in muddy fields. Your longbow leans by the door, strung tight and worn from years of use. Today may be a day of battle, or another day training in silence. This is the world of a medieval archer, brutal, demanding, and often forgotten in the shadows of knights and kings. You were likely born into poverty, the child of a farmer or craftsman. From a young age, your hands were shaped not by luxury, but by labor. If you were lucky, your village valued archery. And so, while tending sheep or planting crops, you were taught to shoot. A stick became your first bow, a bale of hay your first target. Over time, your aim sharpened, not as sport, but as survival. Training was relentless. Your arms had to grow strong enough to pull a war bow, sometimes requiring over 100 pounds of force. No gym, no instructor, just repetition, bruises, and patience. You trained your body until one arm became visibly stronger than the other, your fingers calloused, your spine bent. But every shot made you a little faster, a little deadlier. You weren't preparing for tournaments. You were preparing for war. Your gear was simple, but essential. A linen tunic, maybe a leather jerkin for protection, and tough boots worn thin by endless marches. You carried a quiver strapped to your belt or back, filled with arrows you often made yourself. Each arrow mattered. Fletched with goose feathers, tipped with iron, or bodkin heads, every shaft had a purpose: pierce armor, punch through mail, or drop a charging horse. Your longbow was a part of you, as tall as a man, made of yew, and curved with the power to kill at 200 yards. You learned to respect it, not as a tool, but as a weapon of war, a companion, a burden, a lifeline. Life between battles wasn't peaceful. You weren't paid well, if at all, and when campaigns ended, many archers returned to the same poverty they came from. Some took to banditry, others to mercenary work, foraging, hunting, even stealing, anything to survive. You were respected only when needed, feared for your skill, yet forgotten once peace returned. But you carried on, practicing, sharpening arrows, listening for rumors of the next warlord hiring men with bows. Because war, cruel as it was, offered one thing peacetime didn't: purpose. And then came the call to arms, the banners raised, the horn blew. Lord summoned archers from villages and towns alike. You marched for days, sometimes weeks, carrying everything on your back. Rations were scarce. Mud, rain, and cold followed every step. Alongside dozens, sometimes hundreds of others, you arrived at the battlefield, exhausted, hungry, but ready. There was no glamour, just the stench of sweat, rust, and fear. You lined up, not for honor, but because it was your duty and your chance to live another day. Before the battle began, there was tension, long hours waiting, stomachs twisting in silence, the clink of metal, the mutter of prayers, the sound of sharpening blades. You stood in formation, eyes fixed on the horizon. You couldn't see the enemy clearly, just a blur of colors and banners in the distance. Commanders shouted orders, runners darted between ranks. Then a horn sounded. This was it. You raised your bow, nocked an arrow, and aimed high. The sky darkened for a moment as hundreds of arrows took flight beside yours. You didn't watch them land. You already had another arrow ready. Your job was to keep shooting again and again until someone told you to stop, or until the enemy broke through. Arrows rained like death. Some found targets, flesh, armor, horses. Others missed, but it didn't matter. The goal was disruption, chaos, pressure. You fired until your fingers bled, until the bowstring carved lines into your arm. You couldn't hear anything, only the thump of arrows, the screams, and your own breathing. Sometimes the enemy charged through. That's when things changed. You dropped your bow, grabbed a short sword or dagger, and fought hand to hand. You weren't trained for that. You weren't armored for it, but you fought anyway because running meant death. And maybe, just maybe, surviving meant another day's pay. After battle, you didn't go home. You marched, sometimes for days, through rain, snow, or blistering heat. You camped in the mud, under thin tents or none at all. Food, hard bread, dried meat, if you were lucky. You shared lice, disease, and stories. You cleaned wounds with wine or fire, and you waited for the next command. Life as an archer wasn't just dangerous, it was exhausting, soul-crushing. But you did it again and again because that was your place. You weren't a knight, you weren't a noble. You were a weapon with a heartbeat, nothing more, nothing less. If you were injured, you had two hopes: that the wound wasn't fatal, and that someone cared enough to help. There were no field hospitals. Maybe a priest, maybe a friend with a needle. Infection was the real killer. Even small cuts could turn deadly: gangrene, fever, madness, and no painkillers, just wine, prayers, and grit. You saw comrades die slowly. Some begged to be put out of their misery. Some were left behind. You couldn't save them. You could barely save yourself. Payday wasn't what you imagined. If you survived, if the commander remembered, if the Lord had gold, then maybe you got your coin. But often, promises were broken. Soldiers were paid late, or not at all. Loot was rare and dangerous to collect. Many archers died poor, buried in shallow graves, their names forgotten. Glory? That belonged to knights and kings. You were just part of the machine, replaceable, disposable, but necessary. And that, perhaps, was the most bitter truth of all. But it wasn't all just pain. Archers had their own sense of pride, a brotherhood forged in fire. You trained together, fought together, bled together. There were moments, brief as they were, of laughter around the fire, jokes about nobles, stories from home. It was those small flickers of humanity that kept you going. You learned to read the weather, track movement in the woods, judge distance by instinct. You became part of the land, silent, patient, deadly. In that way, archers weren't just warriors. They were craftsmen, survivors. Every arrow you carried mattered. They weren't infinite. You had to recover them when you could, even from fallen enemies. Some were broken, some bent. You checked each one before battle. A bad shaft meant a missed shot, or worse. Your quiver was both your weapon and your burden. Arrows had to be straight, strong, and sharp. Fletching mattered. You'd spend cold nights repairing them, hands trembling, because in battle, your life could depend on a single shot. And you knew it. Your bow was more than wood and string. It was your lifeline. You had to care for it just like a knight did his sword. You kept it dry, checked the tension, replaced the string when it frayed. In some battles, Archers urinated on their bowstrings to keep them from freezing. Strange, but true. A snapped string meant death. So you kept your bow near you at all times, even when you slept. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a part of you, an extension of your will, a silent promise that you were ready to fight again. You didn't choose this life, it chose you. Most archers were born into it, raised by fathers who strung bows before they could write their names. By the age of 7, you'd already drawn your first bow. By 10, you could hit a bird from 50 paces. The longbow was more than a tool. It was an inheritance. And like all inheritances, it came with weight, expectations, duty. You didn't dream of glory. You dreamed of surviving another winter. That was enough. Life as a young archer wasn't only about hitting targets. It was about becoming part of something larger. Your village expected you to serve, to defend. Your father taught you the art of fletching, how to craft arrows from ash and goose feathers, how to oil your bow against the rain. There were no rest days. Each evening was another practice session. Each bruise on your arm was a lesson. The bowstring didn't care about your pain, only your discipline. By adolescence, your place was set. You were no longer a boy, but a soldier in training. The local lord's men might arrive unannounced to drill the youth, testing your accuracy and composure. Your future wasn't in your hands. It hung on your draw strength, your posture, your ability to follow orders without hesitation. Some cracked under pressure, others thrived, but all of you learned that war didn't wait for readiness. Your first real campaign came faster than expected. A border dispute or a noble's quarrel. You were ordered to march, maybe a dozen miles, maybe 200. The roads were muddy. Supplies were thin. Your boots blistered, your hands ached, but you kept moving. Because if you didn't, someone else had to carry your gear or your body. You weren't fighting for glory, you were fighting because you were told to, because you were afraid not to. Your bow became an extension of your body. In battle drills, you were taught to fire 3 arrows per minute, sometimes more. Precision mattered less than pressure. You were the opening strike, the rain of death before the swords clashed. You learned to read distance quickly, to adjust for wind and chaos. No time to think, only muscle memory. The whistle of arrows in the air was a language of its own, one that spoke of survival. Tensions in camp were always high. Food was bland and scarce. Sleep came in snatches. Disease moved faster than the enemy. And always, someone was on edge. A veteran with a twitchy blade, a commander shouting about formations, or a scout whispering of enemy movement. You were always preparing, always packing, always halfway to fear. A single mistake, a stray cough, a misplaced arrow could mean death, not just for you, but for your brothers in arms. Then came your first real battle. It wasn't what the tales promised. There was no music, no honor, no heroic charge, just the snap of bowstrings, the screaming of horses, the crash of bodies. Your fingers bled from the draw. Your ears rang with the sounds of chaos. You couldn't see the enemy, only shapes in the mist, but you fired again and again, not for victory, not even for pride, just to make it home, just to stay alive. After the battle, the silence was louder than war. The field was littered with broken arrows, shattered shields, and the groans of the dying. You weren't allowed to mourn. You were ordered to collect salvage, arrows, weapons, anything useful. The dead were counted, sometimes burned, and then you moved on. No time for grief, only duty, only orders. Some nights, when the fires burned low, stories were told, not of glory, but of close calls, of comrades lost, of the one moment that nearly ended it all. You listened, sometimes you shared, but mostly you stared into the flames, your hands still trembling, your body aching from the strain. The fire crackled, the night crept on, and you whispered thanks, not for surviving, but for still feeling. Back at home, if you made it, things never felt the same. People celebrated your return, but they didn't understand. You saw things differently. You walked with a limp, slept with one eye open. The bow was still with you, hanging above the hearth. A reminder, not of victory, but of survival. You were no longer just an archer. You were a witness, a keeper of a truth no one wanted to hear. The seasons kept turning, but war always lingered in the background. When the Lord sent his call again, you answered, not with the eagerness of youth, but with the weariness of someone who knew the cost. Around you, new recruits fumbled with their bows, eyes wide and naive. You helped them, showed them how to stand, how to breathe, how to stay calm. You weren't a captain, but they looked to you like one. You saw your younger self in every nervous glance. In the quiet moments between campaigns, life almost felt normal. A crust of fresh bread, the sun warming your back as you cleaned your arrows, laughter shared over muddy ale. You learned to treasure those moments because beyond the next hill, another march waited, another fight, another friend who might not return. You held on to peace where you could find it, knowing it was borrowed and short-lived. Years passed. Your aim remained steady, but your joints ached with every draw. The string felt heavier, your steps slower, but the others listened when you spoke. Even knights respected your silence. You no longer chased glory. You chased wisdom, the kind you could pass on before it was too late. The bow no longer defined you. It accompanied you, a quiet partner in a life shaped by conflict, loss, and a stubborn will to endure. Your final battles weren't always on bloodied fields. They were quieter, against your own memories, the faces that visited your sleep, the choices that haunted your quiet moments. You stopped counting the men you'd killed. You remembered their eyes instead. You still polished your bow, not because you expected to use it, but because it felt wrong to let it fade, like it had earned your respect and your grief. You trained boys who never saw war, and you were grateful. You watched them grow strong in peace, not blood. Sometimes you'd sit under the same tree where you once carved arrow shafts, listening to their laughter echo through the fields. And for the first time, that sound didn't sting. It healed. You realized survival wasn't just living through war. It was learning how to live after it. Old age came slowly. You weren't a legend, just a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. The village kids called you the bowman, and some feared you until they saw you feeding birds or fixing a broken fence. You had stories, sure, but more than that, you had scars that didn't need words, and that was enough. You weren't looking for recognition. You only hoped to be remembered with kindness. When you finally laid your bow to rest, it wasn't with sorrow, but with peace. You had carried it through fire, through storm, through years of pain and grit, and in the end, it had carried you too. not to glory, not to riches, but to a quiet life, a full life, the kind only earned by those who endured. You were a medieval archer, not a hero, not a myth, just a man who did what he had to and lived to tell it. And that is the end of the archer's story, not carved in stone, not sung in heroic ballads, just lived in silence, hardship, and quiet strength. If this journey gave you a deeper look into the real, raw side of the Middle Ages, then join us here on Medieval Explained for more untold stories from history. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. See you in the next story.